Ago, I went to New Zealand to a World Orchid Congress down there. Just to give you an example of how small the world is, I signed up for what they said, spend an evening with the New Zealand family, where you went out and had dinner with somebody, maybe not even an orchid grower, maybe somebody that had a few orchids. Well, the guy that picked me up at the hotel, wonderful dinner, got to talking to him. He was a railroad engineer, and just good, common people, just like us. But we were driving back somewhere, and he said, "And where did you say you were from?" And I said, "From Texas." And he said, "My wife and I just made our first trip outside of New Zealand. We went to see one of my pen pals." Obviously, this was before the days of email. He said, "And we went to Texas. We went to some little town called Bourne or Bernie or something." You're on the other side of the equator, halfway around the world, and this guy's just gotten back from Bernie. So, literally, you'll find orchid growers are extremely friendly people who are usually willing to share pieces of plants and certainly lots of knowledge. So it's a great hobby to get into. Yes, ma'am.
Well, the other side of that, could you talk about the plants, the orchids that are native here that you recommend?
Okay, I don't recommend native orchids here that you necessarily culture them. Because the orchids are such a huge group of plants, some approximately 30,000 species and probably now about 300,000 hybrids. Most, or yeah, I would have to say most of the orchids that occur in nature are not showy. They're interesting plants. The little plant that I found on my ranch has a little white flower. It's about this big, and the flowers last about 3 days. Nobody would really want to grow that plant. The ones that grow over in the big thicket. Interesting, fascinating little plants, but they're not especially showy. The blooms aren't especially long-lasting, and they're difficult to culture in a pot. So the orchids that are native in this area, unless you're part of a botanical garden or something like that and wanting to preserve these orchids from developing places, you know, don't worry, don't try to grow them because they're not something. I mean, when you get a phalaenopsis that's going to stay in bloom for 8 months at a time, and you've got a little native orchid that's going to stay pretty for 8 hours.
But if you had a native, you know, like the native plant garden or something, is there an orchid that you would put into that? And then related to that, how, I mean, in nature, you don't have these special years and years and years in a glass bottle. How do they grow in nature?
In nature, the seed pod that's this long and about as big around as your thumb probably has 2 million seed in it. If 1 out of 1 million seed lands in the right spot and lives to maturity, that's fine with nature, because you know, you've got such a huge, huge number. You take another plant like a palm tree or a coconut palm, probably virtually every coconut is going to survive and grow. So if that plant produces 15 seeds a year, it's happy. Orchids, the seed is as fine as dust, is wind dispersed, and in nature a tiny, tiny fraction of the seed ever live to grow to maturity. And as far as putting them in a garden, most orchids grow in such a specialized niche that your chances of being successful with them are really pretty small. If you can create an East Texas swamp thicket, then you can probably grow some of the things that grow over there, but good luck. It's not going to happen in South Texas. Yes, ma'am.
I have a friend that's got quite an orchid collection. They're beautiful. She puts crushed eggshells on the surface of her pots.
Good way to get rid of eggshells. She probably read a book from a part of the country that was low in calcium.
Well, she's from the Philippines.
Okay. You don't have a lot of calcium in the soil or water in the Philippines, and eggshells are an important source of calcium.
Okay.
Here they're an important source of white junk to put on top of the pot that's never going to go away. Don't tell her that.
I won't tell her.
But no, eggshells don't really serve a lot of purpose in our water.
Okay.
Yes.
I have one of those orchids, and last year it didn't bloom, but it put out little baby orchids, one on each of these stems. This year it put out 2 more, and it bloomed. When the orchids fall off, and mine last usually 3 months, should you cut those off?
That's a good question. I think you should definitely repot your plants, because if it's making little plants, the root system is probably not real happy. But on a phalaenopsis, and this is about the only plant that it would be true of, when the blooms are gone, do not cut this spike off until it turns brown and crispy. Because many times it will put on little side branches and additional buds. And sometimes, if the plant's really happy, when these buds fall off, it'll put out another bloom spike from the side branch. So I would not cut the bloom spikes off on this one until they turn brown and crispy. Every other kind of orchid I can think of, the Oncidium types, the Cymbidiums, the Dendrobiums, Vandas, things like that, I've never seen them make new plants out on the bloom spike. So once the flowers have faded, cut the bloom spike off. It'll make it prettier. But on a Phalaenopsis, don't cut them until they turn crispy because they may give you additional plants.
Okay, and if part of it comes brown,
cut off
okay,
where it
cut
turns
off
brown.
the brown.
Because sometimes that'll happen. Up here where the blooms are, that'll turn brown and this will stay green. But leave the green portion because you may get another plant or two out of it. I think you were next. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yes.
What causes scale in the first place?
Scale or insects? Scale tend to be moved around because scale, like aphids, produce a sugary excretion that ants like. And ants will pick up little baby scale and take them around and put them on different plants so they can go back and eat the honeydew that they produce. The scale are an insect, and they're usually transported about by ants. Yes?
Can I use the ladybug soil for the terrestrial plants?
For the terrestrial orchids, you would do best to mix some bark with it or some not real finished compost. Ladybug soil is too heavy even for terrestrial orchids.
Okay.
I would, if you want to use some of their soil, mix about half and half bark and maybe put a little core or something in it, maybe a little bit of long fibered sphagnum in it to hold it
What
a little
about
bit more open.
compost and bark? Is that better?
Compost and bark would be fine.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I'm starting to see miniature Oncidiums for sale, and I tried one. I've had real good luck with the big orchids, and the miniature ones just...
The miniature Oncidiums are principally what are called equitan Oncidiums, and they're little plants that aren't happy in pots. They're much happier growing on a slab of wood, and you really need a greenhouse to grow them. You need to water them probably every day, and under those circumstances, they are extremely easy to grow. But the only time that I've really seen an equitan Oncidium grown successfully in a pot is where somebody took the little piece of cork that it was growing on, set it down in a pot, and didn't put anything else around it. But the miniature Oncidiums, equitan Oncidiums, they come mainly out of Jamaica, and there are some fascinating things. There's an old fellow passed away now in Hawaii named Goodale Moyer that did most of the hybridizing and research on these things. And grow them on plaques, grow them on pieces of cork or wood. A friend of mine, well, actually two different people that have gotten to grow them very successfully. One goes to hardware store wherever and buys one of those cork boards that you use to like stick pins in for messages. Cut that in little 4x4 pieces and use that to grow your equinans on. Probably the most unique way I've ever seen of growing these and some of the other little epiphytic orchids. A friend over, I guess down in Corpus actually, had a wine shop and collected wine corks. And he would take his glue gun, he would put a piece of wire down and wrap it around one of the corks, and then he glue about 30 corks together just in a big clump of wine corks and put a couple of little equitan Oncidiums on there and tie them on to get them started. And he'd have these balls of wine corks hanging down with these beautiful things. Little equitan Oncidiums, you can tell I love orchids. They make a little plant about this tall, but the bloom spike will be about this long. It may have 50 or more brilliantly colored flowers on it. But you almost have to have a greenhouse to do well with it. But you'll get hooked. Give it a try. Yes, ma'am.
I have about 15 of the phalos and only 3 bloom this year. So something's right that any of them bloom. What can I do to promote more blooms?
More light. If an orchid is not blooming, it's almost certainly not getting as much light. And there are about